Let's just move on to our next set of speakers, co-presenters. Kopano mentioned men's violence against women, also men as the subjects and objects of violence. So the next set of presentations is from Wynne Russell, who's an independent researcher at the Athena Consortium. She's based in Tasmania in Australia. And her co-presenter is Onen David Owech, who's from Uganda. He works for the Refugee Law Project. So Wynne, and then you have the same amount of time, 15 minutes, so you could share it between the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I'm afraid I'm going to need a bit of help also to close down this slide and to bring up our presentation. Thank you so much for this opportunity to address this fantastic conference. I'm afraid that we are Lara Stempel, but I'd like to think that perhaps we're going to, thank you. No, it's this one here, please. I hope that we won't be a disappointment because you're going to get two for the price of one. I will speak briefly on the overarching issue of conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys, and Onen is going to be speaking about the specific experiences of the refugee law program in Uganda working with male survivors. We've stayed very tightly focused on the topic of the panel. Conflict-related sexual violence against adult men will be our particular point of reference to that. Conflict-related, that's violence that occurs as part of the playing out of armed conflicts. Adult males, we're going to be focusing on that for reasons I think will become obvious. We can talk about children later on. In violence like this, gender is particularly starkly visible. While other elements of the conflict certainly also apply, such as race and religion, and again we can speak about these later on. Poverty and inequality are also at play, and the political economy of sexual violence is a fascinating subject in itself. Nevertheless, this is an issue where gender appears remarkably prominently. Just to give you some quick statistics, conflict-related sexual violence against adult men has been recorded in 27 conflicts in the last decade. The prevalence rates on those large N studies that have been done, for instance in Liberia, 32.6% of adult males surveyed had suffered sexual violence. In DRC, 23.6%. The Refugee Law Project recently did a screening, finding around 25% of males had experienced sexual violence, and in conditions of torture, that can run as high as 50 to 80%. Thinking about understanding the gendered roots of violence, sexual violence, particularly against adult males, really can be thought of as the ultimate act of patriarchal control. It's a mechanism by which men are placed or kept in a position subordinate to other men. It is gender-based violence. It's violence where victims are targeted on the basis of gender roles traditionally assigned to their sex. For perpetrators, dominating another male can add to a sense of power. For survivors, violence like this is intended as an attack on their masculine identity, on the masculine identity of other men, for instance, by raping a woman in front of her husband. That is a communicative action directed at her husband. And, as Anthony Keaty pointed out in his presentation, on nonviolent masculinities. The main impacts of sexual violence are physical. Those can be on masculine identities are physical. That can include genital mutilation or castration. Psychosexual, that can include feelings of feminization and impotence. Psychosocial, that can include feelings of loss of the respect of wives, families, and communities. I should note that I'm moving through this very quickly because we are trying to keep to time. Both Onen and I have publications on this subject. We've both written briefing papers on care and support for male survivors and a variety of other papers. So please, we'll be delighted to discuss all of these issues in greater depth in question time, or we're happy to share our publications with anyone who's interested in more detail. Because we want to keep specifically focused on the title of the panel, Responding as well as Understanding. And in terms of responding, I'm going to talk a bit about responses aimed at perpetrators. And Onen will be talking about responses aimed specifically at survivors. In terms of responding to perpetrators, I'm afraid that at this stage, really, we're talking about the same kinds of responses that are available in addressing issues of torture, for instance, because so frequently sexual violence against adult males in the context of conflicts is intended as, it is in effect a strategy of war, and as a consequence is less of a social practice than a military practice. And so two key issues are ending impunity and challenging military cultures. In terms of ending impunity, international instruments are increasingly moving towards gender-neutral language. The UNSC Resolution 1820, for instance, includes men and boys in its discussion of sexual violence, and the International Criminal Tribunals on Yugoslavia and Rwanda both acknowledge male-directed sexual violence. But there's still a long way to go, frankly, where impunity is involved. Taken as a whole, international human rights instruments, and here I should point out, I'm channeling Lara Stempel, this is from her paper. International human rights instruments are better at emphasizing men's responsibilities than they are at acknowledging men's vulnerabilities. And while instruments often start out with inclusive language, inclusive statements, in the body, as Sandesh Shivakumaran has pointed out, the language frequently becomes more and more female specific, with the result that when it comes to issues of specific recommendations on implementation of measures, in fact, frequently men and boys are absent from the final recommendations. And in international criminal tribunals, male-directed sexual violence frequently, even though language exists in the remit of the tribunals to address male-directed sexual violence as a sexual crime, frequently it's prosecuted as torture rather than as rape. One thing I should point out, and I apologize, my slides are not as beautiful as David's. One thing I should point out is that also all of this occurs against a backdrop of domestic legal contexts in which frequently male-directed sexual violence is not recognized. For instance, many countries, the definition of rape is applied specifically to women. It is explicitly in law an act by a male perpetrator against a female victim. The possibility of a male victim, let alone the contentious question of a female perpetrator, is completely absent from the legal context. In addition, of course, many male survivors face the double challenge of living in societies where homosexuality is illegal. And as a consequence, that severely complicates issues of disclosure, since obviously survivors are afraid of getting caught in that net. In terms of changing military cultures, frankly, I think we still have a very long way to go. One of the things that was raised in an excellent presentation earlier in this conference was the fact that when asking militaries and paramilitaries to consider how they want to abandon the use of sexual violence, it's necessary to advance arguments as to how this violence does not serve your purposes. And in fact, I think that this is an extraordinarily interesting area of research which has not been adequately pursued. We know something about the impact, as Gary Barker so properly put it and eloquently put it at the beginning of the first plenary. We know that violence against the bodies of males often is translated into violence against the bodies of women. But we haven't looked so much at the issue of how conflict-related sexual violence might drive other particular types of violence, like, for instance, suicide bombing. For responding on to survivors, however, I'd like to turn things over to Onem.
Thank you so much. I'm David Unen from Uganda, working with Refugee Law Project. And for the last 7 months, I'd like to again tell the world that our work has been suspended on grounds of promotion of homosexuality. And we strongly believe that our work with male survivors is being misinterpreted just by the homophobic host community, which the homophobia is being reinforced by the discriminative laws that Uganda has passed. And just to tell the world that we still have another battle to fight. Much as the court has quashed the law, there's still another bill coming in. And this time around, they're changing the name, but not changing the content. So we still have to make international shouts in the struggle. So coming back to responding to survivors, I think one of the key things we always say is that first thing first, as we work with individual survivors in terms of providing psychosocial and psychological support, in terms of counseling, psychotherapy. We need to extend the support to their families as well, and for male survivors who, many others have not even told their spouses what they went through. And then from there we move to groups. How do we bring them together? So we seem to have very established and well-functional groups for male and for females. But now the key question we're trying to say is, at what point do we bring the female groups and the male groups to jointly advocate as a group of male survivors of sexual violence, irrespective of them being males or females? And this is actually a very difficult point, especially if debates are still on women and girls as victims and men and boys regarded as perpetrators. But what are the key questions we ask when applying the concept of engaging men and boys to end violence against women, especially if there are cases of sexual violence perpetrated to men by fellow men, and also sexual violence perpetrated to men by women, which seems to be kind of a silent subject in this discussion, and also sexual violence perpetrated to women by fellow women. I think this, as a practitioner, these are things we go through every day. When you listen to clients' testimonies, both males and females, these are issues that come up. So as we engage men to end violence against women, how do we also tackle these key questions? I think these are important questions we need to talk to and try to address in the course of our discussion. So how do we engage men then to work with fellow men? And how do we engage men to work with women, and as well as women to work with men? But if these kind of experiences do exist, so at what point do we bring men and women as a group to sit together and agree that, okay, this happened, going forward, what do we do as a joint movement? Of course, the men's group, their affairs, as well as the women groups. The men are saying, are we not challenging our own manhood? At what point do we sit together to talk with these women? We are fathers, we are men, we can't do this. And some of them saying, some of us were abused by women, female commanders, after being in captivity. So how do we meet women who are a representation of the figures that abused us? And then wouldn't the women blame us anyway? Because the large majority of their perpetrators are men. So it's just like a rebirth of trauma. And others will say, I haven't even told my wife. Would I not be putting risk to myself? And women are saying we are beat largely by these women, by the men. So why should we even bother to sit with them on the same table? They will anyway dominate the discussion. They will still suppress their powers on us, and we'll be very quiet in the discussion. And some of us have monuments of trauma as children born out of rape. So seeing this child, and I tribute to a man who gave me this child, I even don't know where he is. This is just a lifelong trauma. And anyway, what will change even if we sit with the men? So I'm bringing this because we've gone as Refugee Law Project to bring both the male and the female groups together. So at the beginning, these were the fears from both groups. Why should we do a joint advocacy? Instead of having women do their own, men do their own, yet we're trying to address sexual violence. But at the end of the day, there were motivating factors. So at the end of the day, why would we come together? Definitely, we need a strong voice for collective advocacy. And definitely, we need to challenge the concept of who is a perpetrator and who is a survivor here, because the man you're trying to say is a perpetrator is also a victim in his own. And by the fact that you're a refugee issues in itself a cause and an impact of sexual violence. And we also need to reach out fellow men by use of men to challenge injustice. So these were the motivating factors that brought the groups we're working with together. But now we need to ask two big things. And one of the big asks, I'll need to help you grab a mic, and in terms of support for survivors.
Like to be directing to pro-feminist organizations as no. Thank you so much. I think the two big asks that we would be like to be directing to pro-feminist organizations are, first of all, to join with organizations working with male survivors to advocate for better support for male survivors. As many of you will know, I've got a recent article in the issue of Voicemail that's in your conference kits. I think that there is fantastic potential for male survivors to be allies in efforts to combat violence against women. But one thing that has come out again and again in interviews that I've done with representatives of organizations working with male survivors, and I would absolutely welcome, please, input from anyone here working with male survivors or with female survivors on this issue, is that until males are getting the support that they need, it's not going to be easy for them to reach out to support female survivors. And so as a consequence, strong support for male survivors actually has the potential to benefit female survivors as well.
Thank you so much. And if you sit in sessions, and I have a minute to go, the men will tell you, before you ask me to do all these beautiful things, I still need my own issues sorted. How do I go into the public and start talking about this? How do I even start childcare work with my wife? If I still have untreated wounds, if I still wear diapers, if I cannot control urine, I cannot control feces because of what happened to me. So how do I even go to that discussion if I still have issues I need to address? And that's why we're saying we need to do a few things first by addressing the immediate needs of men, just like we have a system relatively for women. And the next one is we need to be brave and overcome institutional barriers. I know it wasn't easy for us starting to even push forward the discussion about bringing women and men's groups together. So overcoming institutional barriers would definitely provide a kind of substantive support. Thank you so much.